What an absolute nightmare these stories are. Caught between the utter elation of not being dead, but the horror of being at your own funeral? What a mess! Let's dive right into the top 10 terrifying times people woke up at their own funeral. Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Gilberto Araujo. This Brazilian man was pronounced dead back in 2012 after his body had been identified at the morgue by his brother. A terribly tragic story. Gilberto worked at a car wash in the town he lived in, and one day while at work there was a killing that took place. When the body arrived at the morgue, they had family of the staff come to try and identify who exactly had been killed, and unfortunately, Gilberto's brother had the awful task of doing so. Flash forward to the day of the funeral, and the family members are standing alongside the coffin, mourning his death and lamenting how people could be so cruel. So imagine their surprise when Gilberto turns up at the door. Yeah, turns out that this was just a case of mistaken identity, and this killer had taken another employee's life, and the brother misidentified his own sibling as the victim. I'm not gonna lie, there would probably be a lot of confusing emotions in that moment. Gilberto himself was probably really glad to be alive and see how his family loved him, but he might want to keep an eye on his brother, who apparently has no idea what he looks like. In our number 9 spot today, we have Noela Rukundo. Back in 2016, this story made headlines as a resident of Australia returned home to attend the funeral of her stepmother. This is obviously very sad, but not abnormal, but the story quickly gets out of hand as, unbeknownst to her, her husband had some sinister plans. He arranged a hit on his own wife. His plan was meant to take place while she was traveling for the funeral, and those who were hired to carry out the plan even did grab her. However, these turned out to be very empathetic hitmen for their line of work because they realized what the situation was and that the hit was ordered by her own husband, so they felt a little bad and let her go. She returned home with a plan. At her own funeral, she planned to confront him and reveal his terrible plans and how they had failed. In the end, he was sentenced to 9 years in prison, which likely would have been a lot more should those men have not let the woman go. In our number 8 spot today, we have Walter Williams. Walter was 78 years old and living in Mississippi when, on February 26, 2014, he was pronounced dead. There of course is a system with these things, and Walter began going through these steps. There was paperwork completed, he was placed in a body bag, and he was taken to the funeral home to be prepared for his funeral. William, however, only made it as far as the embalming room when those with him got quite a fright. His legs started to move. The coroner then looked closer and saw that he was even breathing, just slightly. Walter was in fact alive. In a turn of events though, this new lease on life turned out to be short-lived, as just a little over 2 weeks later, he passed away, for real this time. His family even double-checked, just to be sure. In our number 7 spot today, we have Nicephorus Glycas. This is a man who was working as a bishop in Lesbos, Greece, when he was pronounced dead on March 3rd, 1896. Based on the traditions at the time, his body was then placed on display at the Methmony Church. This might seem like a strange practice, but in this particular story, it truly worked out for the best. On the second night of what is known as the exposition of the corpse, things drastically changed. It was on that night that the bishop just sat up. Apparently he even demanded to know what all the fuss was about. He was totally confused. Turns out he was asleep or something? I'm not entirely sure how no one knew he was in fact alive in this scenario, but in the end everything was fine and he continued on with his bishop duties until his true death date came. In our number 6 spot today, we have Edison Vicuna. This man from Ecuador has a story that starts when he went missing for 3 days and his family began to assume the worst. After these 3 days, there was a body of a man found who had been in a terrible car accident that left his face unable to be identified through those means. The man was taken by the authorities and a post-mortem examination was conducted, and this is when the body was confirmed to be that of Edison's. The family was of course distraught and began mourning their loss immediately, which included planning a funeral. As the day of the funeral came, the family members and loved ones were terribly sad and going through the motions before everyone began screaming in horror as Edison himself, very much alive, turned up to the funeral, pretty drunk too. The funeral was stopped and the body was returned to the morgue. As it turns out, Edison was in fact alive, and the body was later properly identified, and it belonged to someone completely different. In our number 5 spot today, we have the couple Telepathy. There was an elderly couple who had been married for over 50 years, and they were so close they joked about being able to hear each other's thoughts. I feel like Taylor can hear my thoughts already. I don't know, man. It's only been like a year and a half, but that man, he's a mind reader. Unfortunately, in this scenario, the woman fell ill, and after a couple days of being in a coma, she passed. Her husband was of course terribly upset over the loss of his life partner and had to be pried away from her. He became very distraught and began insisting that his wife was still alive. Even after she had been buried, he begged for her body to be exhumed, saying he had visions and dreams of her trying to get out of her coffin. After this went on for a while, they finally agreed to dig up the coffin in order to give the man some peace of mind, but when they opened the coffin, to everyone except for the man's surprise, they saw bloody scratch marks all over the inside of the coffin, and the woman's fingernails were bent backwards. Maybe they really could hear each other's thoughts. Either way, they definitely should have listened to him sooner. In our number 4 spot today, we have Fagilyu Mukhametzyanov. This Russian woman suddenly collapsed back in 2011 at her home following a heart attack. She was quickly rushed to the hospital, but soon after arriving, she was pronounced dead. A few days later, her body lay in a coffin at a funeral home as her loved ones gathered to pay their respects and say their final goodbyes. While everyone, including her, was really surprised when she woke up at her own funeral. As she lay in the coffin, she woke up, saw mourners around her crying, people praying for her, and she abruptly realized what was going on and she began screaming. She was quickly rushed back to the hospital where she only lived for an additional 12 minutes in intensive care before she passed again, this time permanently. It is clear that this entire ordeal took quite a toll because in the end, heart failure was listed as her official cause of death. In our number 3 spot today, we have Mohammed Rayhan. After a government airstrike took the lives of over 100 people in Syria, Mohammed was identified as one of the casualties of the incident. He was inside of a local shop when the strike occurred and he was pronounced dead, although buried under the rubble of the blast. Hearing this tragic news, his friends and family began to plan his funeral and even went ahead with it without his body, because at that point it was unclear if it would ever be returned to them based on the size of this mass casualty. Well, those that loved him were in for quite a shock when Mohammed himself turned up to his own funeral. Turns out that Mohammed was in fact buried under the rubble, but he was alive. He was trapped for 36 hours before finding a way to free himself, and when he turned up at the funeral, he even still had debris on him. I can't even imagine what everyone there was feeling. The funeral undoubtedly turned into a major party. In our number 2 spot today, we have Hamdi Hafez al-Nubi. Hamdi was working as a waiter in Egypt back in 2012, but one day at work he suffered a heart attack that ended up claiming his life. He was declared dead and his family took his body back home and washed it, which was a part of their traditions in order to prepare the body for burial at the end of the week. Later, when the doctor was called in order to officially sign the final death certificate, he noticed something strange. He began to examine Hamdi's body further, and this is when he noticed that not only was it still warm, but that he was still breathing. The doctor alerted Hamdi's mother, who was absolutely elated to find out this news. As far as I could find, it appears as though once recovered, Hamdi was totally fine, albeit probably a little shaken up after what he had just endured. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Countess Emma. This story starts off in 1761 when Countess Emma married the very wealthy Earl of Mount Edgecombe. Flash forward to a time when Emma met quite an untimely fate and she was pronounced dead. She ended up being buried, and her burial included her being laid to rest with a valuable ring. There was a church steward who had been spying on the family as this burial was taking place, and this little spy noticed this valuable ring and devised a plan to steal it. He returned under the cover of darkness, but when he went to snatch the ring, Emma is said to have awoken, cold, confused, and dressed in her burial shroud. The thief was fairly terrified and probably thought he was seeing a zombie, so he quickly fled the scene, never to be heard from again. Emma, however, made the half-mile journey back to her home, where everyone was absolutely shocked to see her alive. To commemorate this absolutely bonkers story, the estate where she once lived now has the Countess Path, which is a walkway dedicated to the journey that Emma took from the grave back home. In the end, Emma met her actual death in 1807. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thanks so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I'll see you again soon. Bye!